We are doing a quick survey of the sacrificial system in Leviticus so that we can get back to Exodus chapter 29, the ordination of Aaron, and understand better the sacrifices that are offered there. And last time we looked at Leviticus chapter 1, and if you want to open there, we'll glance there again, and we'll read selectively. These are things that God told Moses before the tabernacle was set up, and has to do with the various offerings. There are 5 basic sacrifices. Who wants to tell us what they are? Ascension offering, sin offering, trespass offering, grain or tribute offering, and peace offering. There are 5 sacrificial animals. Who wants to tell us what they are? Bull, goat, sheep, turtle dove, pigeon. Where were these 5 sacrificial animals set out the first time? Genesis 15. And God tells Abraham to offer those 5 animals. Up to that time, people offered more animals than that. And that's probably worth remembering when you consider the Gentile cultures outside of Israel in pre-Christian times, even afterwards, whatever remnant of truth might have been known. The fact that they offered other animals is part of the Noachic covenant. But once we get to the specificity of the Abrahamic covenant, then it's limited to 5, and Israel only had 5 sacrificial animals. The other nations might have pleased God with others as well. So the first thing that is discussed here is the burnt offering or ascension offering, and that's what we have to call it because that's what it literally says, and that communicates a lot more to us. And so we ascend or send up certain animals that represent us, because we're not good enough to go into God's house. The cherubim are there with flaming sword to keep us away. These animals go through the flaming sword. They go into the fire, and then they ascend up as smoke. So they pass the flaming sword test that we can't pass. And they represent us before God. And so Leviticus 1 gives us 3 categories of ascension offerings. The one from the herd of the bull, the one from the flock, which is sheep or goats, or the one from birds, which is turtle doves and pigeons. And those are the 3 paragraphs here. And you'll notice that the emphasis here is on the flesh of the animal. I want you to notice that today. It says, let's just read the ritual for the bull. Remind ourselves what it says in verse 3. If his offering is an ascension from the herd, he shall offer it a male without defect. He shall offer it at the doorway of the forecourt of the tent of meeting, that he may be accepted before Yahweh. And he shall lay his hand on the head of the ascension, and it will be accepted for him to make atonement on his behalf. He shall slay the young bull before Yahweh, that is, the son of the herd. Remember, all the sacrifices are sons. He shall slay his son, the bull, before the Lord, and Aaron's sons, the priest, shall offer up the blood and dash the blood around on the altar at the doorway of the tent of meeting. And then he shall skin the burnt offering and cut it into its pieces. The layman does this. The sons of Aaron, the priest, shall put fire on the altar and arrange wood on the fire. Then Aaron's sons, the priest, shall arrange the pieces, the head and the fat part over the wood that is on the fire on the altar. So the clean outer part and the clean inner part go on. And then after they've been put on the fire, the entrails, however, and the legs he shall wash with water. So the unclean inner part and the unclean outer parts are washed, and while the clean parts are burning up. And the priest shall offer up in smoke all of it on the altar for an ascension, a food offering as a soothing aroma to God. What is meant by the fact that, first of all, the head and fat are put on the altar, and then afterwards the entrails and legs are washed, and then they're put on? Christ ascends first. And then we go afterwards. We are represented by the guts and the legs, and we're washed. So Christ ascends, and there's baptism, and then we ascend. And that's the meaning of this. But you'll notice the emphasis here. Well, you don't see this unless you contrast it, but we'll see in the other sacrifices we're not told about cutting it up into pieces, and it's not all described. But here we have several sentences that list the 4 basic pieces of the animal that is cut up into, and how they are put on the altar and in what order. And similarly, as regards the sheep and the goat, it says in verse 12, he shall cut it into its pieces with its head and its fat. The priest shall arrange them on the wood that's on the fire that's on the altar. And the guts, however, and the legs he shall wash with water, and then he shall offer them up. Then we considered the grain offering. You always have a grain offering, or literally tribute or gift, put on top of the burnt offering. You never have an ascension that doesn't have tribute. The animal ascends, he ascends with tribute. It says in the law 3 times, thrice in a year all your males will appear before the Lord, and they will never appear empty-handed. Whenever you appear before God, you don't appear empty-handed. I know that we have a hymn that says, nothing in my hand I bring, simply to thy cross I cling, but even there, you're not appearing empty-handed, you appear clinging to the cross. When Jesus ascends, what is the tribute that he brings before God? Bob has answered enough questions, so someone else can answer. It's in Ephesians. He says he led captivity captive. What does that mean? Behold, I and the children thou hast given me, it says in Hebrews. Yes, it's us. We are the tribute that Jesus brings. What is the tribute that we bring? If we ascend, we have to bring tribute. Well, lots of stuff, but tithing is one of them. St. Paul says that he's offering all the people that he makes. Paul sees himself as a priest who's going around sacrificing a bunch of animals, which are all the people that he's bringing into the church. So Paul says, I want to offer you all up. So the imagery of bringing animals into the court and offering them to God is transformed in the New Testament into bringing people into the church and offering them up. But you could say that bringing your tithe week by week is what we offer to God. So we always come and ascend in worship with tribute. And the grain here is tribute. It's always bread. And actually the Lord's Supper draws from this. The Lord's Supper is called a memorial. This is the sacrifice is called a memorial. There's no blood connected with it, and it always involves bread that's broken up. Let's read this over real quick and review. Now, when anyone presents a tribute as an offering to the Lord, his offering shall be of fine flour, and he shall pour oil on it and put frankincense on it. Now, what are these 3 things? Oil, frankincense, and flour are the elements that are in the holy place. And so we really construct a tabernacle in the fire. The incense is equivalent to the altar of incense, the oil is equivalent to the lampstand, and the flour is equivalent to the table of showbread. And that's actually built on the altar in a fiery form. And so what the animal ascends into is the palace of God. And it says in verse 2, he shall bring it to Aaron's sons, the priest, and shall take from it his handful of its fine flour and of its oil and of its frankincense. And the priest shall offer it up in smoke as a memorial portion on the altar, a food offering of a soothing aroma to the Lord. So the Catholic idea that in the Lord's Supper that the bloody sacrifice of Christ is represented is wrong. I remember in Catholic school they would tell us that if you bit on the wafer, your mouth might fill up with blood because the blood is in there. Well, there's no blood. That's once and for all. On top of that is offered bread. And if we were to look over at Leviticus 15, you'd find out that wine is always offered at the same time this bread is. That's what we do. It's the memorial that points back to the blood sacrifice that's finished. There's no blood here. And whatever mysteries are connected with the Lord's Supper, it's not an extension of the sacrifice of Christ in some bloody sense. Rather, it's a picture of it in bread, and the bread is always broken, as we're about to see. Verse 4 says, when you bring an offering of a grain offering baked in an oven, it shall be unleavened cakes of fine flour mixed with oil, or unleavened wafer spread with oil. And if your offering is a tribute made on a griddle, it shall be of fine flour, unleavened, mixed with oil, and you shall break it into pieces. Jesus took bread and broke it and said, this is my memorial. This points back to me. This is a bread offering that points back to the finished blood offering that's underneath it. You shall break it into bits and pour oil on it. It's a tribute. If your offering is a tribute made in a pan, it shall be made of fine flour with oil. When you bring in the tribute that's made of these things to the Lord, it shall be presented to the priest, and he shall bring it to the altar. The priest shall take up from the tribute its memorial portion. So no matter how it is, you're going to have to break it up. Take some of the flour out, or take part of the loaf off. Take the memorial portion and offer it up in smoke on the altar as a food offering, a soothing aroma to Yahweh. And the remainder of the tribute belongs to Aaron and his sons, a thing most holy. It belongs to Aaron and his sons. Can they take it home to their wives and children and use it as part of the family meal? That's right, because it's holy. Only Aaron and his sons can eat of it. Now we come in chapter 3 to where we left off last week. And this is the peace offerings. Let's read this over. Peace offerings involve a shared meal. They're very close to the communion meal that we have, except that when you come to the New Testament, these things are all put together a certain way. Notice that the communion meal that we have is most similar to the grain offering here, the tribute, which is broken up and has bread and wine. And only the priest can eat of it, so you've got to be a priest to eat of it. How do you become a priest? We're studying this now. This is our larger context. The ritual for ordaining a priest is equivalent to what in the New Testament? Ordination or baptism? No, it's not equivalent to ordination. Ordination is by laying on of hands, and there's no laying on of hands in the setting aside of a priest. The ritual for making a priest starts with washing and is equivalent to baptism, and all the other things that happen. So, if you are going to come to the Lord's Supper and eat this tribute offering of broken up grain and wine, only priests can eat it. So what do you have to be a priest? Baptized. Now, occasionally you hear of these situations where people are admitted to the Lord's Supper without being baptized. That doesn't make any sense biblically, you see. Only priests can eat of this food, and you need to be baptized to come to the table. And so that's pictured here. Well, another aspect of this meal with the Lord is set out in chapter 3, the peace offering, although the meal aspect isn't quite as clear here. Let's look at what is focused on here. This is verse 1. If his offering is a sacrifice of peace offerings, and the word there is shalom, if it's a shalom offering. If he's going to offer it out of the herd, whether male or female. So a burnt offering has to be a male, the ascensions. But the peace offering can be male or female. He shall offer it without defect before the Lord. In verse 2, he shall lay his hand on the head of his offering and slay it at the doorway, that's the forecourt, of the tent of meeting. And Aaron's sons, the priest, shall dash the blood around on the altar. And so far it's the same. The blood is there, so God sees it, like at Passover. God needs to see the blood, so then he accepts the sacrifice and has peace with man. And from the sacrifice of the peace offerings he shall present a food offering to the Lord. The fat that covers the entrails, and all the fat that's on the entrails, and the 2 kidneys with the fat that's on them, which is on the loins, and the lobe of the liver, which he shall remove with the kidneys. Then Aaron's son shall offer up in smoke on the altar on the burnt offering, that is, on top of the ascension, which is on the wood that's on the fire. It's a food offering of a soothing aroma to the Lord. Which comes first, the ascension offering or the peace offering? The ascension offering has to come first, so that God is pleased. The atonement is made, and then the atonement is made again with the death of this animal, and then all these parts are given to God. The rest of it isn't. The rest of it's going to be eaten, but these parts, the fat, is given to God. Verse 6, if his offering for a sacrifice of peace offerings to the Lord is from the flock, he shall offer it, male or female, without defect. If he's going to offer a lamb for his offering, he shall offer it before the Lord. He shall lay his hand on the head of his offering and slay it before the tent of meeting. The layman does this, not the priest. Then Aaron's son shall dash its blood around on the face of the altar and pass over, so the Lord passes by, sees the blood, and will not charge the account. Verse 9, and from the sacrifice of peace offerings he shall bring a food offering to the Lord. It's fat. That is, the entire fat tail. Sheep have big fat tails, and that's going to be given, which he'll remove close to the backbone, and the fat that covers the entrails, and all the fat that's on the entrails, and the 2 kidneys with the fat that's on them, which is on the loins and the lobe of the liver, which he shall remove with the kidneys. The priest shall offer up in smoke on the altar as food, a food offering to the Lord. God is eating this. This is a meal shared with God. Verse 12, moreover, if his offering is a goat, he shall offer it before the Lord. He shall lay its hand on his head and slay it before the tent of meeting, and the sons of Aaron shall dash its blood around on the altar, as we've seen. And from it he shall present as his offering a food offering to the Lord, the fat that covers the entrails, the fat that's on the entrails, the 2 kidneys with the fat that's on them, which is on the loins, and the lobe of the liver, which he shall remove with the kidneys. The priest shall offer them up in smoke on the altar as food. Food for God. God eats it. A food offering for a soothing aroma. All fat is the Lord's. It's a perpetual statute throughout your generations. In all your dwellings you shall not eat any fat or any blood. Now, if the ascension offering focuses on the flesh of the animal, and we saw that it's cut up into 4 pieces, and that's the big stress. You put these 4 pieces on in a certain order. What does the peace offering focus on? Fat. Yes, well, we can hardly miss that. The fat, which means the most excellent part, the best part. The best part is given to God. And usually it's the inward parts as well, but the idea of the fat is the best part. That's the big stress here. So think of ascension flesh, peace fat. And the Israelites weren't supposed to eat fat because it's always given to God. Now, as we'll see in just a few minutes, this meal that God eats, and it's said that it's food for God, is also shared with us and with the priests. So there's a common meal here. But the stress here in this passage is on the fat that's given to God as His food. Does anybody have any questions about this chapter, where we are so far?
You said that the layman does the cutting up?
Yeah, the layman kills his sacrifice and cuts it up.
All the pieces? Is it a very ceremonial thing? Is it precise, or the guy just hacking away?
Well, I think that these were all people who were used to slaughtering animals, so they knew what to do. We would probably hack away.
But was that part of the ceremony, how they did that? I mean, was it, do you even know?
They're just told to do it, so it's hard to imagine any ceremonial way of cutting an animal up. Just a sweaty labor. What we're going to do is skip chapter 4 and 5 and part of 6 because these deal with the sin offering and the trespass offering, and we're going to come back to them. But they're different from these first three. And I want to get the information about the first three basic sacrifices down before we look at these other two. The reason these other two are different is that the sin offering and the trespass offering have to do with your right to come in and offer these other sacrifices. And the three sacrifices that we're considering now, the peace offering, the ascension offering, and the tribute offering, those existed before the tabernacle. And those are offered even when the tabernacle is torn down and is not in operation for a century. Remember, from Samuel to Solomon, there was no temple. And so these other sacrifices don't apply. But the purification and trespass offerings have to do with whether or not you have the right to cross over into this sacred space. Once the sacred space is gone, you don't have this problem anymore. And that's what we're going to have to look at when we get to it. So they are extensions of the fundamental principles of sacrifice. Here, we're looking at these more basic ones. So let's get some more details. Leviticus, once God has finished describing the sacrifices and what's offered to God, He turns around and says the parts that we get to eat. And that starts in chapter 6, verse 8. And so we're going to look at chapter 6, verse 8 and continue reading here, just to try to get a broad picture of how these sacrifices are done. Chapter 6, verse 8. Then Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, Command Aaron and his sons, saying, This is the law for the ascension. The ascension itself remains on the hearth of the altar. So the altar is a hearth in God's house. This is just a quick picture here. What is the tabernacle? It's God's house, and this is the hearth. And God lights the fire on His hearth, and the servants of the house are supposed to keep it going and supposed to offer things on it. Once the house is built and God moves into it, God kicks off His shoes and starts the fire on His hearth. That's what we're going to see eventually. That the tabernacle is built in Leviticus 40, and the glory moves into it and takes a seat on the throne, and then fire comes out and starts the fire on the hearth. That's what you do. You come home at night, you take off your clothes of the day, put on comfortable clothes, take your shoes off, put your slippers on, and then get the fire going in the fireplace. That's what's going on here. So only this is God's, and God has these servants. See, if you are a big manor house, then you'd have servants to do all that for you. They'd bring you your slippers. They'd fix the meal. That's what the priests are supposed to do. They fix the meal. They keep the lamps lit. You have a big manor house. The owner of the house doesn't go around lighting the lamps at night. The servants go around lighting the lamps at night. That's what these priests do. The owner of the house doesn't cook the meal. The servants cook the meal. That's what these priests do. That's the basic picture here. This is Yahweh's house. It's His palace, and these are the palace servants, and they're supposed to keep the fire on the hearth. The fire on the hearth on the altar is to be kept burning on it. Now, verse 10 says, The priest is to put on his linen robe, and he shall put on the undergarments next to his flesh. And that's to cover his nakedness, remember? And he shall take up the ashes to which the fire eats the ascension on the altar and place them beside the altar. It's literally the fire eats the ascension, consumes it. Now, God is consuming the food. It's food for God. That means that God eats us. That's what it means to be saved. A picture of that is that God eats us. That's how we get into the body of Christ, is that we get eaten into the body of Christ. Where does the New Testament talk about that? Very straightforward picture of being eaten by God. You all know it by heart. What? On Lord's Supper, we eat Christ. Where did we have a picture of Him eating us? You've heard this 1,000,000 times. No one can remember it. You have heard this 1,000 times, where Jesus is eating us up. I know your deeds are neither hot nor cold. I wish you were hot or cold. Because you're lukewarm, neither hot or cold, I'll spit you out of my mouth. What are we doing in His mouth? He's eating us. That's what it means to come into the body of... it's just a picture. I know it's not a picture that we usually use. We are not real familiar with the symbolism and imagery of the Bible. But when you grab your baby and bite his neck and kiss him all over and say, I'm going to eat you up, it's kind of similar to that. Kissing is eating anyway. And that's what this is pointing to here. We get eaten into Christ's body. We become part of Him. We eat Him. He gets into us in the sacrament. He eats us. And the fire on the altar eats the sacrifice and takes it into God's fellowship. This is not a biological idea. It's a community idea. But to be taken into the community, an image of that is eating. That's why the law has so much to say about what you eat. You don't eat unclean animals. That means you don't take pagans into your community. You do eat clean animals. That means you have community with the clean animals. And similarly here, the fire of God's presence, this is the Shekinah fire, eats the offering. So God takes the animal into His community, into community with Him. It becomes part of the cloud. That's the picture. Sorry if that's new and shocking, but see, I didn't write this. And you all know that Jesus will spit us out of His mouth, so we can just think about that a little bit. See, that's a picture of getting close to the kingdom and not being faithful enough to stay in. All right. So the fire eats the ascension that's on the altar, and the priest takes these ashes that are leftovers, and he puts them beside the altar. And in verse 11 says he takes off these linen garments and puts on other garments and carries the ashes outside the camp to a clean place. We're not going to discuss all that part. The fire on the altar shall be kept burning. It shall not go out. The priest shall burn wood on it every morning. He shall lay out the ascension on it and offer up in smoke the fat portions of the peace offerings on it. Fat portions of the peace offerings. So fat is emphasized. Fire shall be kept burning continually on the altar. It's not to go out. We get the idea. God's presence is always there. And people can't see the Shekinah glory, which is behind all the shrouds, but they can see the fire on the altar, which is equivalent. In the Holy of Holies, on the cherubim throne here, God is enthroned in the fiery cloud, but nobody can see that. But the cherubim send out with their flaming sword a fire that's out here on the altar. Produces a cloud of smoke over it. That's something you can see. And that's a visible manifestation of the invisible presence of God. Hebrews says our God is what? A consuming fire. Now, if God is a consuming fire and He's going to eat us up, then what do you want to be made out of? You want to be made out of gold, silver, and precious stone, or do you want to be made out of wood, hay, and stubble? Which is going to survive the fire? Well, the wood, hay, and stubble are not going to survive the fire. The gold, silver, and precious stone will be refined and purified, and also they start to shine. You put these metals in fire, they start to glow and shine. And that's part of what it means to be eaten up by God's fire. So the ascension is there, but this paragraph says keep the fire going all the time, so that God's presence is visible to the people in the form of this fire. Now, verse 14. This is the law of the tribute, that is, grain offering. The sons of Aaron shall present it before the Lord in front of the altar, and one of them shall lift up from a handful of the fine flour of the tribute offering with this oil and all the incense that's on the tribute offering. And he shall offer it up in smoke on the altar, a soothing aroma, as a memorial portion to the Lord. And what's left of it, Aaron and his sons are to eat. It shall be eaten as unleavened cakes in a holy place. They are to eat it in the court of the tent of meeting. So they can't carry it outside the tabernacle courtyard. They can't take it home. It's only for the priests themselves to eat. Verse 17 says, it shall not be baked with leaven. I have given it as their share of my food offerings. It is most holy, like sin offering and the guilt offering, which we haven't considered. As them shall become consecrated. Now, since we're all priests, this applies to us. So, in the Lord's Supper, we're given this bread to eat. There's a lot more going on here, but you can just take that away from it. That the parts that are given to the priest to eat that are holy, that are to be eaten in church, this is part of it. Now, verse 19. Then Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, this is the offering that Aaron and his sons are to present to the Lord from the day when he is anointed. Now, this is going to be every morning and every night from the time they're anointed. The tenth of an ephah of fine flour as a continual tribute offering. So this is continual. This isn't just on the day he's anointed, but from that day forward, every morning and every evening. Half of it in the morning and half of it in the evening. So a 20th of an ephah of fine flour in the morning and a 20th in the evening. Now remember, we saw different kinds of tribute offerings last week. I won't ask anybody to remind us of all the different ways you can bake one, but here is one of them. The griddle type. The griddle type is the type that's offered every evening and every morning. It shall be prepared with oil on a griddle. When it's well stirred, you shall bring it. You shall present the grain offering in baked pieces as a soothing aroma to the Lord. So you always break it up. Jesus took bread and broke it. You always cut the animal up. No matter what the sacrifice is, except for the Passover, you always cut the animal into pieces. If it's a bird, you wring its head off. The other animals are always cut up. The burnt offering tells us in detail how to cut it up. The peace offering, as we're about to see, is also cut up. And so that is imaged by the breaking up of this bread, which is simply a memorial, an unbloody memorial that points back to the bloody sacrifice. You break it up, and you always do. And so this taco is made here on the griddle with oil. You break it up, and then it's presented to the Lord.
We're not doing that with ours. We're not breaking our bread, we're cutting it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I would prefer to have a loaf and break it. I don't know that the details are quite... You do miss something if you don't do the breaking, I think. Verse 22. The anointed priest who will be in his place among the sons shall offer it. By a permanent ordinance it shall be entirely offered up in smoke to the Lord. So every grain offering of the priest shall be burned entirely, it shall not be eaten. So the priest doesn't eat any of this, it's all given to God. But he does of the other kinds. Now, that's laws for grain offerings. We have a little bit better picture of this regular sacrifice. You always have a tribute offering on top of the ascension offering, morning and evening. And in this case, it's a griddle one. Now let's look at chapter 7, verse 11. Again, we're going to skip the sin and guilt offerings because we're going to come back to them next time and look at them in more detail. But let's finish up these three basic ones. And the reason why this passage is in the order it's in, there's reasons for it, but we're not studying Leviticus, so we won't go into all those things. Let's just get the basics down here. Verse 11. This is the law of the sacrifice of peace offerings, which shall be presented to the Lord. Then there are three different kinds of peace offerings. This will be on the test. If he offers it by way of thanksgiving, then along with the sacrifice of thanksgiving he shall offer unleavened cakes mixed with oil, and unleavened wafers spread with oil, and cakes of well-stirred fine flour mixed with oil. So three different kinds of tribute offerings are offered along with it. So the bread offering is also offered with the peace offering. Verse 13. With the sacrifice of his peace offerings for thanksgiving, he shall present his offering with cakes of leavened bread. So in addition, there's some cakes of leavened bread that are offered. But these won't be put on the fire. These are just contributions, as we would find out later on. You don't put leavened things on the fire, but you can offer them to God. Verse 14, and of this he shall present one of every offering as a contribution to the Lord. Your Bible may say heave offering. Heave offering or contribution to the Lord. It shall belong to the priest who sprinkles the blood of the peace offerings. Now, we're about to have two different kinds of offerings here. The heave and the wave. The heave offering, there's no ritual connected with it. It's actually just a contribution. And the wave offering is actually lifted up. Now, I say this because of the translation heave offering and wave offering, people have the idea that the wave offering is waved before God and the heave offering is heaved up before God. But that's not true. Here we are again with the problems in translation. The wave offering is actually all this stuff that's put on Aaron's hand. We're going to see it's the breast of the peace offering, and it's given to God and then received back. And when that happens, it's holy and only the priest can eat it. The contribution is just something given. It's not held up to God or anything else, and so it's not most holy, and the priest can take it home and share it with his family because it's just a donation. Now, this is a thanksgiving one. Then he shall present one of every one of these as a contribution. It will belong to the priest who sprinkles the blood of the peace offering. So the priest gets some of the unleavened cakes mixed with oil and some of the unleavened wafers spread with oil and some of the cakes of well-stirred fine flour mixed with oil and some of the leavened bread cakes. He gets some of them, and it's just a donation. So, can he take these home and give them to his family?
Just a donation?
Yeah. Yes. Verse 15 now. Now, as for the flesh of the sacrifice of his thanksgiving peace offerings, it shall be eaten on the day of his offering. He shall not leave any of it over until morning. Why is that? We discussed this before, but I realize that there are many, many details here, and perhaps you don't remember every one of them, which is why you have me to help you, because I have studied this a lot, being my job. Why is it that after 24 hours you can't eat this peace offering anymore? Does the peace offering go bad?
It's losing its efficacy as time goes by.
The peace offering loses its efficacy as time goes by. Wrong.
But it sounded right.
It sounded right. No, what happened was you're losing your sanctification as time goes on. The sacrifice made you good enough to draw close to God and eat this, but now you're just kind of falling back, and you better not touch it anymore. It's too holy for you. You're falling back. Now, what does that communicate to people in the Old Testament times? That these sacrifices never took away sin. See, they're not permanent. Now, it's different for us because Jesus makes us permanently holy. We fall into sin, but we don't fall away from positional holiness, so to speak. But you're falling away, and so it's dangerous now after a day. I mean, this thing is so holy, if you eat it, you're in real danger. You better stay away from it. Now, verse 16 says, if the sacrifice of his offering is a votive or a free will offering, it shall be eaten on the day he offers his sacrifice, and on the next day. What is left of it may be eaten, but what's left over of the flesh of his sacrifice on the third day shall be burned with fire. God's fire. It's holy. God eats it. So it's not that the sacrifice is no good. The fire can take it. But you're not good enough to. So that would give us certain degrees. The Thanksgiving offering, you have to be a little bit holier to eat of, and after one day you've already declined to the point where you can't eat it. The vow offering and the free will offering, you don't have to be quite as holy to eat them, so it takes 2 full days for you to decline and for your sinfulness to remove you from the possibility of eating it. Verse 18 says, so if any of the flesh of the sacrifice of his peace offering should be eaten on the third day, he who offers it will not be accepted. It shall not be reckoned to his benefit. It shall be an offensive thing, and the person who eats of it shall bear his own iniquity. Also, the flesh that touches anything unclean shall not be eaten. It shall be burned with fire. As for other flesh, anyone who is clean may eat such flesh. So, as regards the peace offering, people can eat it. That's the point here. It's a communion meal.
This is quite a concept here when you really think about it, because what you're saying, or what the Bible is saying, is that these people whose job it is to be good people lose it. How do they do that? Well, it's got to either be through action or thought. So the assumption is that even a person who's dedicated to being set apart for God is losing it constantly, which is really the testimony to the sin nature of man, if you can be in that position and still just slip away.
Yeah, that's right. It's a good way to show human depravity. You get pulled up and then you slide back. Something permanent needs to happen, and these animals are not permanent. These animal sacrifices don't do the permanent job. Verse 20 says, a person who eats the flesh of such a sacrifice of peace offerings that belong to the Lord, if he's unclean, we haven't even discussed the kinds of uncleanness, but we're going to be mentioning them here. That person will be cut off from his people. When anyone touches anything unclean, whether it's human uncleanness, that will be an issue of blood or of life, or an unclean animal or any unclean detestable thing, and eats the flesh of the sacrifice of peace offerings that belong to the Lord, that person shall be cut off from his people. What does it mean to be cut off? Killed? No, excommunicated.
What he said just a second ago, is that because in necessarily a 1201 they're going to have a bad thought, or the sin imputed by Adam?
No, it really is neither one. It's the sin nature that's inside, the corruption. Now, this contrast between clean and unclean is, again, something we don't need to go into. The point is, a person's got to be in a good moral state to eat this. He's got to be clean. And he can't have the accidental uncleanness. So, you ladies, if you just had a baby 3 weeks ago, could you offer a peace offering? No. Because you're unclean for 40 days if it's a boy and the boy is circumcised, and you're unclean for 80 days if it's a girl. So you can't have anything to do with a peace offering during that time. You men, if you came into the kitchen, or you came into the living room and your dog had died during the night and you picked him up and took him outside and buried him, could you have a peace offering that day? No, because you've had contact with a corpse. It's not wrong to have that. It just means you can't go to the tabernacle till this goes away. If somebody in your family dies, you're unclean for a week if you're in the same room with them. And it's your responsibility. They didn't have funeral homes back in those days. If someone died, you made the coffin. You took care of it. But everybody who was in the same room with the dead person was unclean for a week after the last encounter. Just to be in the same room. This is uncleanness by overhang. If you're in the same enclosed area with a corpse, a human corpse, which is the most defiling thing of all, you're unclean for a week. You have to be sprinkled with the ashes of a red heifer. That's in Numbers 19. There's a whole big ritual connected with that. But you can't have anything to do with a peace offering, and if you did, you'd have to be excommunicated. So that, again, shows us that the privilege of eating the peace offering has to do with how holy you are, and you can decline from it. Well, now in verse 22. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the sons of Israel, you shall not eat any fat from ox, sheep, or goat. The fat of an animal that dies, the fat of an animal torn by beasts, may be put to other use. You can make candles out of it or something, or soap. I don't know what you make out of fat. You can make whatever you make out of fat. But you can't eat it. No animal, not just a sacrifice, any animal,
What do they want to know why it's ordered for a man?
Because he's circumcised. The boys are circumcised, and that cuts the uncleanness time in half. That's Leviticus 12. Uncleanness is cut in half by circumcision. Circumcision is a sacrifice. Circumcision is a substitutionary sacrifice that cleanses the woman partially. You don't circumcise girls in the Bible. There is a cruel form of female circumcision that's done in other religions, and it's a contrast to the Bible that that's not done. But the bloody circumcision of the male child is a sacrifice that, among the many things it does, it atones for the uncleanness of the woman and cuts her uncleanness time in half. If they don't circumcise the son, then it would be 80 days. Same as with the girl. In the New Testament, then baptism does it. You have in the medieval church, and still in the older copies of the Book of Common Prayer of the Episcopal Church, a ritual for the churching of women. That women stayed out of church after they had a baby until they were actually received back into the church by this ritual. And although it's kind of generally based on Leviticus 12, it's really more based on the fact that it was so risky to give birth in pre-modern times that they felt that coming to church and offering a special prayer of thanksgiving was appropriate because the woman had actually survived childbirth. We don't think of not surviving childbirth anymore, but that's a benefit of modern medicine. In the old days, every time a woman had a child, she was running a big risk. But you still have, in the medieval and early Reformation churches, a ritual that's somewhat similar to that. That woman stays away from church and rests up, and when she comes back, she offers a special prayer of thanksgiving for having gotten through the ordeal of childbirth. We're back to fat. Now, everybody's favorite subject. Now, when it says you can't eat fat, that doesn't mean that when you cut a steak off and there's a ring of fat around the side, you can't eat that. It means the fat that's been described already, the lobe of the liver and the fat tail and the things that have been mentioned in the text. That you can't eat, no matter whether the animal is a sacrifice or not. Or if it's a deer or a gazelle, or a sheep or a... Well, actually it says ox, sheep, or goat. So I guess as far as a deer or a gazelle is concerned, you could eat it. Verse 25 says, "For whoever eats the fat of an animal which is a food offering offered to the Lord, even the person who eats shall be cut off from his people. And you're not to eat any blood, either a bird or animal, in your dwellings. Anybody who eats any blood, even that person shall be cut off from the people." Now let's quickly try to finish this up here. This is interesting here. "Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the sons of Israel, saying, He who offers the sacrifice of his peace offerings..." And by the way, notice this word sacrifice. He who offers the sacrifice of his peace offerings. I haven't called attention to that, but the word sacrifice is used throughout here, and it's not used of the other offerings. And we think of them all as sacrifices, but actually the Hebrew word for sacrifice is used almost exclusively for the peace offering. Just a point that is worth considering in the psalm when it says, "Sacrifices and burnt offerings you have not required." Sacrifice there means peace offerings. Literally, it's peace offerings and ascensions you have not required. It's not a general term. Usually, the word sacrifice refers to this meal, which I think is why the early church referred to the communion meal as a sacrifice. They were thinking Hebraically and using that word sacrifice in the sense of a common meal. And we use it to think of killing the animal. Our use of the word is different somewhat from the use that's in the Bible. But the word sacrifice is used primarily for the offering that you have as a meal, the peace offering. So let's go back to 29 again. "He that offers the sacrifice of his peace offerings to the Lord shall bring his offering to the Lord from the sacrifice of his peace offerings. His own hands are to bring food offerings to the Lord. He shall bring the fat with the breast, that the breast may be presented as a wave offering before the Lord. And the priest shall offer up the fat in smoke on the altar, but the breast shall belong to Aaron and his sons. And you shall give the right thigh to the priest as a contribution," heave offering, your Bible may say, but contribution or donation, "from the sacrifices of your peace offerings. The one among the sons of Israel who offers the blood of the peace offerings and the fat, the right thigh shall be his as his portion. For I have taken the breast of the lifted or wave offering and the thigh of the contribution or donation from the sons of Israel, from the sacrifices of their peace offerings, and have given them to Aaron the priest and to his sons as their due forever from the sons of Israel." At this point I made a mistake in the lecture and said that the breast that is lifted up and given to God and then received back is holy in such a way that only the priests may eat of it, and all the priests, but not their families. Whereas the leg, which is simply a contribution or a dedication, is given to the priest who helps you out, and any member of that priest's family is free to eat it. Well, that's not really correct. Both the lifted breast and the donated leg can be eaten by the members of the family. The difference is that the breast that is given to God and then received back from Him goes to all the priests and all their families. So whoever needs it can take part of it, divide it up, take it home, feed his wife and kids from it. Whereas the leg goes to the particular priest who helped you out and offered the sacrifice for you since you're not able to. That's the actual difference between the two. What had me confused, and what has some commentators confused, which is part of the way I get confused, is that certain of the bread offerings, tribute offerings, can be eaten only by the priests. But as far as the peace offering is concerned, the part that's lifted up and given to God is given back to the priestly company as a whole. The part that's not lifted up and given to God is given to the priest. And it's on the same level as the communion meal that the offerer has. And so there's kind of a meal at two levels. There's God, and God eats with all the priests and their families. And then you eat, and you eat with a particular priest who helped you out. And then those two meals are really one meal. We won't go any farther into that, but I imagine from time to time in some of the other lectures I will say this wrong. Well, let me make the correction here, and bear it in mind if you hear me stumble again at some point. We'll read this again, verse 30. His own hands, the offerers, you, are to bring the food offerings to the Lord. He shall bring the fat with the breast. The breast may be presented as a wave offering before the Lord. The priest shall offer up the fat in smoke, but the breast belongs to Aaron and his sons. Now, who eats first? God eats first. You offer up the fat, and then you cook the rest of it. Eli's sons' sin was exactly in this area. 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 12. You remember this, but I want to call your attention to it because now maybe you have a context for this sin. 1 Samuel 2, starting in verse 12. Now the sons of Eli were sons of Belial. They did not acknowledge the Lord and the custom of the priests with the people. When any man was offering a sacrifice, the priest's servant would come while the meat was boiling with a three-pronged fork in his hand. See, a sacrifice. When you're offering a sacrifice. So which is this? It's a peace offering. The word sacrifice by itself always means peace offering. And so we're cooking food here. The priest servant would come while the meat was boiling with a three-pronged fork in his hand, and he would thrust it into the pan or kettle or cauldron or pot, and all of the fork brought up the priest would take for himself. And this is what they did in Shiloh to all the Israelites who came there. Also, before they burned the fat, the priest servant would come and say to the man who is sacrificing, "Give the priest meat for roasting, as he will not take boiled meat from you, only raw." And if the man said to him, "They must surely burn the fat first, and then take as much as you want," then he would say, "No, but you will give it to me first, and if not, I will take it by force." Thus the sin of the young men was very great before the Lord, for the men despised the offering of the Lord. Now you see what their sin was then. They ate their part first before God ate his, which meant that they had nothing but contempt for God. The offering is concerned with fat, which is given to God, and then the meat is cooked and you eat it. And just for conclusion here, and to prepare ourselves for next week, give you one more little thing to think about. We've already looked a little bit at the purification offering or sin offering. And what is the main stress in the sin offering? Flesh, fat, or what? Blood. It is. This is the offering where all the details are given about where you put the blood. You sprinkle it 7 times, and then you put it on the horns of the altar, and you put it here, and you put it there. Blood is the emphasis. And you can remember these 3 major sacrifices this way. The ascension offering is concerned with flesh. The peace offering is concerned with fat. The sin offering is concerned with blood. And I hope that as we get familiar with these things, then their meaning and implications will become more well understood by us. Let's close in prayer.